November 29th, 2022, and the time is 9:02 a.m. Public hearing for the City of Tampa Historic Preservation. Welcome, everyone. I am Dominique Cobb, the Vice Chair of the Commission. If you are here to present, I see no one in the audience. Okay. Next, since there is no one here to present, the staff, is there a staff report to present?
No, the board members introduce themselves.
Oh, I'm sorry, my apologies. Introduction from the board.
Hi, my name is Susan Swift. I'm a board member, planner with Boggs Engineering.
Hello, my name is Carrie Ann Canch.
Mary Shoecraft, preservationist.
Thank you, commissioners, for joining us today. Now we'll have the staff present the staff report.
Good morning, Dennis Fernandez, Architecture Review and Historic Preservation Manager. If we could begin item number 3, which is the reading of the minutes from the August 30th public hearing. Who would need a motion for that?
I make a motion to accept the minutes from August 30th as is.
Second.
Commissioners, the motion for the approval of the minutes for August 30th has been accepted and approved.
Well, can you vote on the
Yeah.
motion?
My apologies. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Seeing none, motion granted for the approval of August 30th minutes.
Thank you. I'll defer to legal opinion that we're not having any items on the agenda. Is it necessary to do the conflicts of interest?
I'll do it just as an abundance of
Okay.
caution because of the topics. But Kamaria Pettis-Mackle from the City Attorney's Office. Will the commissioners please state whether or not they have any conflicts of interest regarding any of the items that are on the agenda?
No conflict.
No
Thank you.
conflict.
Additionally, will the commissioners please state whether or not they've had any ex parte communications regarding any of the items that are on the agenda?
None.
Thank you.
Thank you. With that, we'll administer the swear-in to the staff. If Alexis could administer the swear-in, please.
You solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you be giving today is the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do. Thank you. With that, commissioners, this morning we have several updates and a discussion that we wanted to essentially provide to you. Had some requests for follow-up on some of the items that we have listed on the agenda. First of all, moving to item number 6, which was previously a recommendation to designate the Bustillo Brother and Diaz Cigar Factory building as a City of Tampa local landmark. That property is located at 2111 North Albany Avenue. Have a go to the Alma real quick and just show you a historic picture of the property, which was constructed in 1902. Consistent with the other cigar factories in the city, obviously this type of building and the history of the use has a tremendous significance to the development of the city, and the Historic Preservation Commission had recommended designation of this property as a local landmark. I'm happy to report that on November 3rd, City Council did approve the local landmark designation of the property. So this is added to the City of Tampa Historic Registry at this time, and we have been working on rehabilitation plan with the property owner. I think he is converting this into residential living for students. So I think it's going to be a great asset to West Tampa, and then also I think a good example for preservation of this building type in the city, particularly in West Tampa where there's a number of these factories present. So we are working on a couple other designations with cigar factories. They they are the type of project that usually are associated with an adaptive reuse when we get the opportunity to discuss historic designation, and that's ongoing, obviously, as the interest in redevelopment of some of our older neighborhoods continues. Even though we've seen the economy slow down a bit, it hasn't stifled some of the development in our original neighborhoods, which is a good thing. Any questions on that before I move on? Okay, great. The other item I wanted to update you on, which was the subject of the minutes that you approved, is the ongoing proposed expansion of the Hyde Park Historic District. That was recommended by the Historic Preservation Commission on August 30th. I know it's a little difficult to see, but it's the area that's highlighted in green, which is north of the district line, moving up to the crosstown essentially. And that area did receive a favorable recommendation from the Hillsborough County City County Planning Commission for the proposal being consistent with the Tampa Comprehensive Plan. As you know, that is one of the steps in the designation process. And this item is scheduled to go to City Council for first reading a week from Thursday. So on December the 8th, staff and the applicants will be presenting the request and your recommendation for their consideration. So we plan for that to be very detailed discussion, and there'll be a great deal of public participation because the notice has already been sent out. And we will continue to update you on the progress of that area as the consideration of its expansion of the local historic district is underway. I don't have a date for a second reading as of yet. We'll get through the first reading, and then I'll continue to update you on the progress of that. Moving to item number 8, if there are no questions on that particular item. Earlier this year, there was a request by the commissioners to provide sort of a dialogue between a few different areas of the preservation program. And I think in discussing some of the opportunities that we have, we felt that today there was time on the agenda to get into a discussion about the designation criteria that's both at the national and how that kind of transcends into the local ordinance. So we have prepared a PowerPoint to assist in the discussion, and then to have some time afterwards to answer any questions and to discuss some of the specifics of the categories that we're going to cover. So if it's the pleasure of the commission, we'll go ahead and present that at this time. Elaine Lund is going to be leading that presentation.
Good morning, Commissioners. Elaine Lund, Historic Preservation staff. So this morning we have a presentation for you, as Dennis stated, regarding the local historic designation criteria. I'm going to take you through a little bit about the National Register criteria on which our local criteria are based, and go through some of the terminology that is frequently used in, with the National Register, and that we use also in the local designation process. So our local historic designation criteria are based on the National Register criteria, which are sort of a national standard. Ours are word for word taken from the Code of Federal Regulations, and are reprinted in the National Register Bulletin 15 about how to apply the National Register criteria for evaluation. These criteria can apply to historic properties that are usually categorized as either a building, structure, object, site, or district. So when we're talking about something that's being designated, it's the property. And then its property type is one of those categories. So I'm going to just give you the definitions of those as provided by the the National Register here. A building such as a house, barn, church, hotel, or similar construction is created principally to shelter any form of human activity. A building may also be used to refer to a historically and functionally related unit, such as a courthouse and jail, or a house and a barn. So a structure is differentiated from a building in that it's not designed for a purpose that creates human shelter. So that might be something like a bandstand, or a boat or a ship, a bridge. Locally, we have the bridges over the Hillsborough River that are locally designated, and some of them are also on the National Register. And then also on the National Register, I can't come up with the name of the ship right now, but the one that's over here at the port is listed in the National Register. It could include something like a grain elevator or a lighthouse as well. Objects are distinguished from buildings and structures as constructions that are primarily artistic in nature or relatively small in scale and simply constructed. Although it may be by nature or in design movable, an object is associated with a specific setting or its environment. So that may be something such as a sculpture, a monument, a boundary marker, a fountain, a statue. Sites are the location of a significant event, a prehistoric or historic occupation or activity, or a building or structure, whether standing, ruined, or vanished, where the location itself possesses historic, cultural, or archaeological value, regardless of the value of any existing structure. So a site might be something like a cemetery or a campground, a habitation site, or a shipwreck. So districts, as you may gather, possess a significant concentration, linkage, or continuity of sites, buildings, or structures or objects, united historically or aesthetically by a plan or by physical development. What separates districts is that there are usually multiple properties within a district. So it's essential that there be the concentration, linkage, and continuity of features. So it could be something like a planned community, such as historically we have like Davis Island or Beach Park. We have some buildings from those areas that we have represented as part of a multiple property listing, which is not a district per se, but those were planned communities from the 1920s. A downtown business district, a early suburb such as Tampa Heights or Hyde Park, college campuses, or a estate or farm with a large acreage and numerous buildings and structures on it. So a district also has to have a definable geographic boundary, and you should be able to know the limits of it should be clear, and they should be based on a shared relationship among the properties that are within the district. The kind of final concept here before we move on to the actual criteria is the historic context. So historic context is sort of a theme or a facet of prehistory or history, and when we're looking at historic context, the significance of the historic property can only be judged and explained when it is evaluated within its historic context. So these contexts are patterns or trends in history by which a specific occurrence, property, or site is understood, and its meaning and ultimately its significance within history or prehistory is made clear. So when trying to decide if a property is significant, you have to look at whether the property is associated with a certain facet of prehistory or history that is significant. And then you must evaluate it compared to other buildings or structures or sites or objects that also are relevant to that particular facet of prehistory or history. And then finally, you must look at whether the property possesses the physical features necessary to convey the aspect of prehistory or history with which it is associated. And we commonly refer to that as the integrity of the property. Pictures on the slide here, just since I didn't mention, is the Stovall House, which was recently added to our list of local historic designated properties earlier this year. It's on Bayshore Boulevard. So in the City of Tampa Code of Ordinances in section 27257 are the criteria to qualify as a landmark site, multiple property designation, historic conservation overlay district, or historic district. The building site substructure, object, or district must have been constructed or achieved its significance during the period of historic significance as delineated in the National Register of Historic Places guidelines or as established in the nomination pursuant to those guidelines. Generally, when looking at historic properties, we look for something to be at least 50 years old so that there's been enough time that has passed that we can take a good sort of academic look at the property and evaluate it within its context. It allows for there to have been enough time to have people who are experts in those particular fields take a scholarly approach and produce some sort of documentation that we, the historians, can use to evaluate the property. There are exceptions to that with some things that are going to be obviously highly significant, like the, on the national level, like the space shuttle launch pads, for example. So when, as I mentioned, integrity was one of the items that you have to look for when you're talking about the historic context and evaluating a property. So the next section of our code talks about how the building, site, structure, object, or district has the quality of significance in American state or local history, architecture, archaeology, engineering, and culture, which is present in district sites, buildings, structures, and objects, that possesses the integrity of location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association. So, this is going to how first, that the property must be significant in one of these general areas, and it can be significant on the state or local or national level, and that it has integrity, and that the property must be an adequate physical representation of its past. So you have to be able to look at the structure and sort of be able to see it as it was at the point in time in which it achieved its significance. We evaluate that on these particular facets of integrity: the location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association. They don't always all apply to a particular property. Some are, more relevant than others. For example, a bridge out of its setting, its original setting, is sometimes not considered to be, no longer considered to be historically significant if, for example, it's been moved from one location to another. But if it's significant still for its engineering, you may still be able to see that in its design and materials. So the specific criteria then that we sort of allude to in the previous part of the ordinance there is that, I'm not going to read all of these word for word, but there are 4 of them, 1, 2, 3, and 4 in our local ordinance, and they relate or are directly taken from the National Register of Historic Places criteria, A, B, C, and D. So to designate a property, it has to meet at least one of these. The first is an association with events that are historically significant. The second is associated with people who were historically significant. The third is talking about characteristics of a type period method of construction, a work of a master, something with high artistic values, or that represent a distinguishable entity whose components may lack individual distinction, which would be a district. That's a lot of significance categories. They're sort of lumped into one criteria. But when we look at that, it helps us to look at different areas of significance. So, for example, it's kind of easy to see when something represents a work of a master or was possesses, well, certain artistic values. But when you're looking at types and periods and methods of construction, you could be looking at architecture or engineering, for example. And when you're looking at the previous two categories, events and lives of persons significant, then you kind of get into some of these other areas of significance that come up frequently, such as commerce or industry, communications, economics. These are more non-tangible, I guess, areas for which something may sorry, I lost my train of thought. Non-tangible areas for which something may, I'll come back to that when we get to the slide on it. All right, and then finally, number 4 is the criteria are for items that have yielded or may be likely to yield information in prehistory or history. And this particular criteria specifically is most specifically used to relate to archaeological sites. And districts, of course, and we kind of went over that a little bit earlier. A district would have the character as a definable, geographically definable area with a concentration of buildings or structures or objects that are well designed and which are united by their plan or physical development, and then has that geographically definable area. The code, before we go back and talk about those criteria a little more specifically, the code goes on to state that in addition to those criteria, the HPC and City Council shall consider the following factors for designation, and those are regarding owner support and economic hardship. Typically, we do not bring something before you without owner support. Something we do like to have in hand before we get this far in the process. This is the one of the cigar factories in West Tampa here. Is it Berryman Brothers? Yeah, Berryman Morgan Cigar Factory. Okay, so back to the eligibility criteria themselves. The first one, events. So association with events that have made a broad contribution or that made significant contributions to the broad patterns of our history. So this might be a significant event marking an important moment in history, or a pattern of events or historic trend that's made a contribution to the development of the community, state, or nation. So examples might be a downtown district representing a town's growth as the commercial focus of the surrounding area. So that would be sort of a business and economic significance. Another example might be, districts are kind of easy when you're looking at events. Community planning and development would be an area where you would look at an area of significance you would consider. Industry, for example, Ybor City Historic District is significant for its association with the cigar industry that on which gave Tampa its economic base and led to its booming growth in the 1890s. So also locally, we have the North Franklin Street Downtown Multiple Properties listing, which is a collection of buildings along this corridor that was originally the central business district of downtown, leading up from about where City Hall is, about where we are here today, toward Tampa Heights. And I believe we have 12 buildings that are locally designated as part of this grouping. So designation eligibility criteria 2, or B, if you're looking at the National Register criteria, are person, associations with persons of lives significant in our past. So these would be people whose activities can be specifically identified and documented and whose activities are demonstrably important, or properties that illustrate a person's important achievements. So an example might be the home of an important civic or industry leader, or the studio of a significant artist. On that second example, the studio would be if you're looking at the historic context of, the art and the artist, the studio would probably be a more significant place than the artist's home, because the studio would be where the art itself was created. So locally, we have quite a few designated historic landmarks that are associated with significant people in our past. We have the Babes of Harris Golf Course in the north end of our city. The Dr. Jacob White Senior House, that was the home of one of the city's first African-American doctors. The George Guida Senior House in West Tampa. The Peter O. Knight Cottage. Mr. Knight was pretty big in the early development of the city. He was involved in, he was a booster, I guess is a good way to put it. Yeah, he was he was very, very pro-development in the area then. And then the Oaklawn and St. Louis cemeteries are significant for the people who are buried within them, such as some of Tampa's first mayor or governor, some other Supreme Court justices. Yeah. So when we're looking at number 3, the third designation criteria, 3 or C in the National Register, we're looking at design and construction primarily. So these properties would need to embody the specific distinctive characteristics of a type, period, or method of construction, represent the work of a master, possess high artistic values, or represent a significant and distinguishable entity whose components may lack individual distinction. I think I've said that a couple of times. So examples would be buildings that are excellent representations of a style of architecture, a movie theater such as the Tampa Theater, embodying high artistic value in its decorative features, bridges that represent significant engineering advancements, or a historic district with a concentrated collections of buildings of a certain style, which would, in looking at that kind of example, you might think of Seminole Heights, which is known for its historic bungalows. So locally, what we have designated, these are some more examples. Like I mentioned, the Tampa Theater for its artistic value and its architecture. The First Federal Savings and Loan Association building downtown, significant for its architectural style. It's one of the few international style buildings that we have in this area. The bridges over the Hillsborough River, these are all movable bascule bridges. Well, not all of them are bascules, sorry. They're all movable bridges. The Hillsborough Avenue is a vertical lift bridge. Columbus Drive is a swing bridge. So they do represent some different types of engineering, and specifically with the swings bridge and the vertical lift bridge, there are only a very small number of those left in the state. The Beach Park Multiple Properties listing, which is significant for its layout as well as its architecture. significant as, the buildings that we have in that grouping are significant as part of the planned development, and they're all of the Mediterranean Revival, Spanish-style buildings. And then the Hyde Park Historic District has a high number of highly designed houses that represent different styles of architecture, but they are all grouped together as sort of significance as being part of where the many people significant in the city of Tampa, where they lived during its early years and through the 1930s. So number 4, or D in the National Register, that criteria, which is information potential, really. It's something that is yielded or may be likely to yield information important in prehistory or history. So as I said, this is typically reserved for archaeological sites, and a good way to sort of evaluate if something is a significant archaeological site is to think about whether it can answer certain research questions. So examples would be a site consisting of a village occupation with midden deposits, hearth ceramics, and stratified evidence of several occupations, or an irrigation system significant for information it may yield on early engineering practices. This Fort Brooke, which is the area in downtown south of Whiting Street. Fort Brooke was the original sort of western occupation site of the Tampa area, and it was a outpost during the Seminole Wars in the early 1800s. It's the area south of Whiting Street, and that entire area is considered to be one very large archaeological site because of the habitation in that area. The fort itself included everything from barracks and quartermasters buildings to stables and cemeteries. So there was quite a variety of structures and sites and buildings within the fort, and this area, while not listed in the National Register or listed locally as a historic property, is still considered to be a very sensitive archaeological site, and it is, when there's development in this area, it's required that a cultural resource study occur so that any items that turn up during construction can be properly cataloged and retained if necessary. So that's pretty much it for the criteria. If you have questions or would like to discuss, we are here to discuss.
Thank you, Elaine, for the designation criteria. I believe that was a wealth of information that the city and neighborhoods could definitely use. Commissioners?
I just have a couple of comments, if
Sure.
that's okay. So, do we have any Native American archaeological sites? I hear Fort Brooke is often mentioned as the archaeological site example.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think a lot of the early evidence was sort of, I guess, damaged in the early habitation years by the fort occupants. There was a significant midden at the about where the around Channelside in that area. I believe a lot of it was primarily a shell midden, if I remember correctly, and a lot of it was used for paving, leveling out property in the early development years. And there are some burials of the Native Americans who were either traded with the fort or were processed through the area as part of the Seminole Wars.
Okay, I have a follow-up, if that's okay with you all? No? So, one of the things that I always, I would say struggled with is when decisions are made, particularly in historic districts, the city has multiple historic districts, and when we take a look at decisions that we have to make about these districts, for example, demolishing buildings or allowing the demolition of a building, which is very significant. Once it's gone, it cannot come back. I always have to look at the context. What was the reason why this particular historic district was designated versus that one? Because they're not the same. You have to think, the story ties back to the reason why. So, example, Hyde Park, classically, its period of significance was 1890 to 1930s. And that was the height of development in Tampa, even during the Depression. And so that's why those buildings are important as a group. Right? It's one of the biggest in the country that still has that kind of preservation. Ybor, again, has its own. Each one of them has their own. So that's something that I always have to look back on, and sometimes I get lost in the weeds a little bit with that. Secondly, 50 years, so that means anything before 1972 is eligible for consideration at this point.
Correct.
And that's something that I always look at as well, because I think everything that's should be preserved is really old, but in fact the line has moved to 1972. That's 50 years ago. So it's anything that was done in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, even earlier 70s is technically eligible for consideration based on the guidelines. And then the last one is a question, which is, can we get an update on I'm going to call it the First Watch building, because I can't remember the name of the building here in downtown, where owners wanted to demolish the building and put a condo tower. Is there an update on that?
Do you have one?
Just where is it in the process? I just haven't kept up.
Good morning, Dennis Fernandez, Architecture Review and Historic Preservation Manager. We had significant discussions with the property owners and their legal representation, and there is a legal settlement that was entered into, and I think I'll need to provide you information. There was a separate attorney that was assigned to that, so for that particular item, I'd rather kind of table that to our next meeting so I can coordinate with them and give you the accurate information, because it's obviously a very complicated issue.
Thank
And your chair is very aware of this. She was involved in some of the discussions internally when we were essentially kind of under a sealed environment with the topic. So Commissioner Salaga has been well engaged in the discussion as well.
Well, whenever it's public, I would like to know.
Certainly, it's public. It's just I want to make sure I have the facts correct before I bring them to you.
Okay, thank you.
I did want to just add on a little bit about the envelope of the designation criteria, and when we bring you proposals, typically the scenario is for the local designation process that we're either receiving an application from an individual property owner or maybe a neighborhood association that is seeking to protect or to recognize a historic resource, or the city might be actually initiating, feeling that a particular type of property or period may be underrepresented, and so we're actually more self-initiating those type of considerations. But when we do that, we try to consider the history of how our local boards have approached criteria for designation, and to keep that consistent. And I think, number one, it's sort of logical that you want to, if a property, let's say in downtown, was eligible for its contribution to commerce, that another property maybe a block away might have that similar eligibility. So we look at those for consistency, particularly in our multiple property designations. And then also in bringing properties forward, we sometimes have to work with the property owner or the party in sort of flushing those different types of things out. But when we bring that to you, there's obviously room for discussion. We've had properties where, you know, the commission has wanted us to kind of take another look and expand upon the criteria. And I think that's a good thing, because if you have a building that has multiple points of significance, it's obviously has more of a historical integrity that should be recognized and protected. So, you know, internally there's a lot of discussion with staff when we, you know, we have these applications before us, in making sure that sort of the history of our program is implemented for future properties. Another sort of unique component of district designations is that you have, within the district, you have both contributing properties and non-contributing properties. Because the approach for a district is unique from that of a landmark site or a multiple property site, where you're just looking at individual properties like Old City Hall that we're in today. Because you somewhat expand the consideration to a preservation approach that is going to ensure that the properties that are contributing and the neighborhood in which those properties are situated is preserved for the future, so that non-contributing buildings that exist are compatible with the historic inventory. So you don't particularly deal with this avenue, but our other part of our program that deals with architecture review is dealing with that all the time, and ensuring that when changes are made to historic properties, or when new construction is introduced into a historic area, that it is both compatible but distinctive from the historic inventory. So there's a lot that goes into it. We deal, you know, with our programs, we kind of deal with segments sometimes of it, but just be assured that once you're done with your charge in preserving properties, that there's a whole nother component out there that's ensuring that the integrity of those properties are maintained, you know, well into the future.
Yes, I think our struggle, some of our struggles have been not so much when properties are within a district, but in these individual properties that are not in a district. And I thought it was worth talking about Commissioner Shewcraft's, the first item, the 50-year, because I have a different perspective on that, or a different maybe interpretation. I think a lot of people characterize the 50 years, first of all, as a rule, or that anything 50 years or over can be considered. And to me, it's that, first of all, anything built yesterday can be considered. It doesn't have to be 50 years old. The community, and on the opposite side, just because it's 50 years, the age is not the first criteria or the most important, in my opinion. So saying that anything over 50 years can be considered, well, yes, but really it's the other factors that we should be weighing first. The significance, is it architecture, is it community development, is it this? To me, that's what brings it to the forefront. And in the community I worked in before, the human genome was discovered, or written, or whatever the formula was. It's actually in City Hall on the wall, within the city limits, in, you know, a 1960s cruddy office building. And much more recently, you know, in the 90s. So frankly, more significant than anything else in this jurisdiction. And that, to me, the fact that, who cares if the building was built yesterday or in the 60s, that was the significant issue and worthy of designation, even if it was in a brand new building that that company had just built. And maybe it wasn't the building, maybe it was the site, maybe, there was a different way of handling it, but the significance was not the age. And I think in a lot of communities, including that one, they actually thought by taking the 50-year rule out that was actually written into the code, they took it out so that anything could be designated. Well, anything can be designated, any year can be, that's not the #1 criteria. And I think just because it's old doesn't mean that it's worthy of designation. And I think that's where, maybe my vote has come down differently. There are good examples that are old, and there are good bad examples that are old, and there are good examples that are less than 50 years that are worthy of designation, and then not so much. So I think for me, the age is way less significant than all the other criteria.
If I could respond, I think that the 50-year is just simply a benchmark. It's certainly not a line in the sand, and I agree with you. Just because it's 50 years or older doesn't mean that it's in any way historically significant, and obviously we can look at events. You can look at, for example, in your case, the genome, that was an actual event that occurred, so something culturally occurred, so that would be the significance, not the building or the drywall or the letter or anything like that. So that's one of the nice things, is that we have sort of this very broad brush of things that you can look at. It isn't just the traditional way of looking at historic preservation, which is an old building, which is one of the nice things about the fact that the guidelines do, the code does allow for different kinds of designation. I think one of the things, though, about, I think contributing and non-contributing is a very sticky point. But those determinations are not made by this board. They're made by the professional staff. And so when something comes to us, and in their opinion, if they think it's contributing, it's my personal opinion that I have to rely on the staff research and analysis, whoever made that first determination, which usually those determinations are made right when something is designated. So in the case of Hyde Park, that would have been at least 25 years ago when those studies would have been done. So that's when it gets very complicated, because what I might consider contributing, you might not consider contributing, or the third person, but on the map, that's the legal designation of the property. They're in color. Even sometimes on the same property, the accessory structure will be considered non-contributing, but the main house is contributing, so it even gets even more complicated than that. But that's all I have to say. Thank you so much for the presentation. It's always nice to get a refresher as to what we're supposed to be looking at when we're looking at these very complicated things.
Oh, thank you. So I wanted to thank you, Elaine, and thank you, Dennis, too, for the clarification, just like how the properties are considered and all the stuff that happens before it comes to our table to vote on, and even afterwards with the Architectural Advisory Board. And yeah, I think it's good just to have the refresher on it. And I think for me, it always boils down to integrity. Like First Watch, it's like, okay, it's associated with a significant person, the architect, right? There's a few examples of his buildings in Tampa, but the building itself is super standard. So it's like, what other criteria is it? Well, yeah, you could do the 50, and I think you only need to have 2 or 3, is it 2? One, okay.
Really only one, yeah.
Yeah, just one, okay. So like, I would definitely say it needs to be like more than just the 50-year mark though. And then it's like, okay, what is the integrity of the building? What condition are they getting it in? So it's like stuff like that, because the boards are still, and the commissions are checks and balances. Because sometimes you can designate an area and like leave off a building that is contributing. Somebody has to come down the line and say, hey, how come you left this building off? Which we had that situation that happened. So it's all like we all rely on each other, I guess. to make proper informed decisions on what is best going forward. So I'm really grateful that you presented it, because it seems simple sometimes, but then it's not, you know, until we have it, flesh it out and look at it to see how we should go forward. But the hope is to always make the best decision, of course, for the building and just for the city of Tampa, so that we can have the resources going forward. Yeah, and preserve the city in a good way, you know? So it's not like everybody's developing everything and then we turn around and we have nothing left. Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Fernandez and Ms. Elaine Lund for that workshop on designation criteria. Next up is the date and time for the next HPC meeting. That is December 13, 2022 at 9 a.m. here at the Old City Hall. And
So if I might just comment on that. So we're most likely not going to need that meeting just because today's meeting is a rescheduled meeting from when Hurricane Nicole kind of displaced our previous meeting. But if there's any business that the commission would like for us to deal with, we can deal with it at that meeting. It's just a couple weeks away though, so it's a pretty quick turnaround. Other than that, we would be moving into January when we start our 2023 calendar.
thank you. All right, next we will have new business. I would like to bring up for discussion, while my time at East Tampa, I noticed that East Tampa was not a historic district, and meeting with different neighborhood associations and members in the community, there were some significant periods in East Tampa. So I wanted to see what could the commission do to kind of have that conversation, bring in the neighborhood associations, and bring in discussion on how East Tampa can't be forgotten for their significance of the city of Tampa. East Tampa is actually situated in the heart of Tampa, but unfortunately, the neighborhood, that area has been marginalized, it's been blighted, and a lot of the original sites were neglected and therefore, demolished. So I wanted to discuss with the commission and also staff to see how we could kind of bring that part of Tampa up to parts and see if maybe that area can be a historic district. As stated throughout the designation criteria overview, Dr. Jacob White Sr., the first African practitioner, his home was preserved, I believe, in 2004 in East Tampa. Unfortunately, a lot of people do not know about that, but there are other significant establishments in that area. So I would like to see if the commission can start the process of engaging the community, connecting with the local historians. I know I went over to the East Tampa Business Association or Civic Association, and they had a wealth of history that could be shared and preserved. So I wanted to bring that up with the commissions if we can discuss that as new business.
Well, I would certainly support having that added to the staff's work program as just something to evaluate initially, because obviously it has to start with the staff. But I would absolutely support that. Thank you.
Same here with them getting time to get their arms around what's available and who should come and how they could put it on our agenda and fill that in. I think that's a great idea.
So Commissioner Cobb, I know you're very involved in East Tampa and sit on a number of committees there. What do you feel is the most effective method to kind of gauge, what properties perhaps might be valued as being historically important in that area? Do you think it would be working through the neighborhood associations or a particular organization?
No, I think it should be done as a collective, because again, East Tampa doesn't really have a designation, and it's not a district, so there's a collective of neighborhood association, but there's also a collection of non-representation. So I would ask that the staff could probably, well, I can work with you all, but I ask that the staff could kind of formulate where to start, because it's not just the neighborhood association, it's also, how do I say, Parks and Rec. It's a lot of things that are significant. For instance, the baseball field that's on 22nd and MLK, that is a very prolific area for, you know, the sports arena area. I'm sorry, the sports arena and baseball, you know, history. So that is something that I believe should be preserved or talked about. So it's not just one particular group. I think it should be a collective of the city and kind of having, I don't want to say a meeting, but it's a lot that's going on in East Tampa, and I feel like with all the new development, a lot of our history is going to be gone. A lot of the stories are not going to be told. A lot of the plaques are not going to be out while people, you know, East Tampa is becoming very walkable, and I would like to see some of that history on the walkways of 22nd. So it's not just, I don't think, neighborhood association. I think it should be a collective of different partnerships.
Okay. Well, let us kind of examine that and bring that back to you at a future meeting. I think, you know, there's some individuals that I know of that would be beneficial to that discussion, as well as yourself. And if, you know, if we need to move it to a more formalized kind of creation of a subcommittee, we can certainly do that at a future hearing. But I think preliminarily, you know, I can begin some outreach and getting some sort of input from some key community stakeholders.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
All right. At this time, the time is 10 a.m. and the meeting for today is adjourned.